Hi, guys, and welcome to Classic Rock and Country Music Facts and Trivia. Appreciate you being here. Please subscribe if you haven't yet. Today's video is a little bit different. I found an article written by Kiss bass player Gene Simmons on Eddie Van Halen. The article is called The Eddie Van Halen That I Knew by Gene Simmons. And I thought this was really interesting, so that's what we're doing today. Let's take a look. When I was told that Eddie Van Halen had died, it hit me like a punch in the face. He was such a kind and beautiful soul, genuinely nice person. He was so non-judgmental, it's impossible to think of him without remembering that ever-present smile of his, or the way that his fingers always flew across the guitar. He made it all look so effortless, but that's absolutely the last thing it was, and it's strange to think that Eddie began as the drummer of Van Halen. Brother Alex was a guitarist until they swapped instruments. Ed had been a classically trained pianist, which is why none of the other rockers could touch his musicality. I first met Eddie on the night that I saw Van Halen playing at Starwood, a small club in Hollywood, in 1976. I've been credited as the man that discovered Van Halen. No, I didn't. I did no such thing. I just happened to be there and witness their greatness at what was still a very early stage. I saw them that night and was left incredulous. I stood at the front of the stage, couldn't believe my eyes and ears. This was one man making all of these sounds with his bare human hands. Everybody in the band was singing and playing live, and Eddie was a complete guitar symphony in his own right. Those early days, Ed would sometimes stand with his back to the audiences because he didn't want to give his tracks away. But even if you saw how he played those licks, how could you possibly emulate them? So I signed the band to my production company, Man of a Thousand Faces, flew them to New York, and produced a demo for them at Electric Lady Studios. If you Google the words Gene Simmons Van Halen demo, you can hear the song that I consider to be Edward's defining moment. Not to be confused with the remake from the album 1984, the version of House of Pain they recorded with me is the most powerful thing they ever did. It erupts from 0 to 60 miles per hour in a second. Play it loud. It's like a steamroller over your face, and the band performed it completely live in the studio. But despite the quality of those tracks that we recorded together, I could not get interest from my manager at the time, Bill Acoin, who has since passed away. Paul Stanley wasn't interested either, and of course Ace Frehley and Peter Criss had bigger things on their minds. They were too busy making bad decisions about life. I'd wanted to take Van Halen under the wings of Kiss. We should have signed him, taken them out on tour with us. Sadly, nobody else in our organization saw it. Of course, months later, Warner Brothers came by and scooped them up. By the time Kiss went out on tour again, they had taken the Kinks. You really got me and made it into something that Ray Davies would never have imagined. They became superstars. And when that happened, I was able to go back to my own band and say, I told you so, you morons. The songwriting was just as important as the music, and David Lee Roth deserves his share of credit. Nevertheless, possibly due to Roth's swagger and acrobatics on stage, Van Halen's songs are often overlooked. That's a shame, as it is their absolute peak. Nobody could touch them. When they went out on tour with Black Sabbath in '78, Van Halen destroyed that band. Tony Iommi admitted it, and so did Ozzy. What really intrigued me about Van Halen was that they came out of nowhere. It seemed like they had no lineage. The big lips and blue-laden songs meant that you could trace the relationship between Aerosmith and the Stones. But to this day, I have no clue where Van Halen came from. Edward has talked about being a fan of Clapton. I'm sorry, I don't see that. Where other guitarists were inspired by B.B. King or Albert King, Edward was playing majors and minors and flat thirds, and what he did was closer to classical music. My friendship with him is something that I will always treasure. In the beginning, we saw one another a lot, but less so as the years passed by. Final meeting was in L.A. We bumped into each other on Sunset Boulevard. He was already deeply affected by cancer. I'd read that he blamed his condition on using a metal guitar pick, putting it in his mouth. In my view, that wasn't the case. Ed smoked all the time. All the same, when I heard that familiar voice calling my name on the street, "Hey, Gene," I wasn't sure what to say. His condition was well known at that point. Brought it up at the start of the conversation. "Hey, man, how you doing? I've got cancer." I was embarrassed and wanted to reach out and hug him, but standing there on the street with a cigarette in his hand and his open mouth, and smiled. "Check this out," inviting me to look at the place where his upper palate should have been. He just shrugged. "I've got this disease. What you gonna do? I'll see you around." typical Ed, happy-go-lucky. Those that had the honor of having met Eddie Van Halen will know that he never said a bad word about others, that he didn't badmouth rival bands. He conducted himself with a shrug of the shoulders. It reminded me of Charlie Chaplin at the end of a movie. He could be left with nothing, tattered and torn, and he'd walk off down the road with nonchalance. That part of his character will always bitch slap to me. With a big ego, I'm full of myself, and I love the sound of my own voice. Spending time in the presence of Edward made me think, I should probably stop this, give up the airs and stupid stuff and just concentrate on being a human being. Eddie was all about the music, not just the chicks of the rock and roll lifestyle. It's something I always admired about him. He was a lover of life. Whenever you met him, he smiled from ear to ear. As much as his death was upsetting, it also made me a little furious that so many of our so-called younger generation remain unaware of his talents. For sake, parents should be slapping mobile phones out of their kids' hands and telling them to check out this guy. Our millennials need to know about the most important musician since Jimi Hendrix. There will never be another one like him. Reason I chose this, one, Eddie Van Halen, he's right. Eddie Van Halen is guitar great icon. But it's not very often you get words like this from the mouth of Gene Simmons about anybody except for himself. He does have a huge ego. I'm a Kiss fan, and I can tell you up front, Gene Simmons has a huge ego. But for me, for him to say something like that about anyone, especially like Eddie Van Halen, he loved the guy. Had to. I just love this. I hope you did too. Please subscribe. And have a great day. God bless you. And be praying for you.